He woke up that Tuesday morning and realized something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself with shouting or slammed doors. This was different. His wife was humming in the kitchen, making coffee like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She hadn't cried in 3 weeks. Not once. And for a man who had spent 5 years watching tears fall because of him, that silence was the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard. Hello, friends. Before we dive deeper, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Florida, United Kingdom, maybe South Africa, or Jamaica. We want to know. Paul Chun sat at the kitchen table that morning, watching his wife move around their suburban Phoenix home with an ease that made his stomach turn. Jennifer had always been expressive, wearing her heart openly, crying when he hurt her, which had been often. But now, as she poured his coffee and smiled at him, actually smiled, he felt something he'd never felt before in their marriage. Fear. Real, gut-twisting fear. Because Paul knew what he'd done. He knew about the late nights, the lies, the women whose names he barely remembered. And he knew that Jennifer knew too. She'd always known. But this time, she wasn't crying about it. This time, she was humming. What happens when the person you've been hurting stops showing pain? What does it mean when tears dry up not because the hurt is gone, but because something deeper has shifted? Paul had been asking himself these questions for 3 weeks, ever since the night Jennifer discovered his latest affair. He'd expected the usual scene, the tears, the accusations, maybe even thrown dishes. He'd prepared his usual defenses, the ones that had worked for years. But instead, she'd simply looked at him, her eyes dry, and said, "I see." Just those 2 words. Then she'd gone to bed. No crying herself to sleep. No confrontation in the morning. Just this new, unsettling calm that had settled over their house like morning fog. Paul told himself it was a good thing. Maybe she was finally accepting who he was. Maybe she'd stopped trying to change him. But late at night, when he lay awake listening to her breathe beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something important, something he didn't know how to get back. Their story hadn't started this way. 6 years earlier, Paul and Jennifer had met at a tech conference in San Francisco. She was a junior marketing manager, bright-eyed and ambitious, with a laugh that made everyone in the room turn to look. He was a software developer climbing the corporate ladder, charming and confident. Their courtship was quick, intense, filled with weekend trips to Napa and late-night conversations about building a life together. When Paul proposed on a beach in Monterey, Jennifer cried happy tears, the kind that came from a place of pure joy. Those were different tears, Paul would later think. Those tears meant something good. They married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends, and for the first year, things were genuinely good. They bought a house in Phoenix, where Paul had landed a senior position at a growing startup. Jennifer transferred to the local office of her company. They talked about having kids someday, about growing old together, about all the ordinary dreams that ordinary people share. But Paul had a problem, one he'd never fully acknowledged even to himself. He couldn't be faithful. The first affair happened 8 months into their marriage. A colleague at work, late nights on a project, the usual cliché. Jennifer found out when she saw a text message on his phone. She confronted him, and when he saw her face, saw the tears streaming down her cheeks, something twisted in his chest. He apologized. He begged. He promised it would never happen again. And Jennifer, because she loved him, because she believed in second chances, forgave him. She cried for 3 days straight. But then she dried her tears and tried to move forward. Paul felt relieved. He told himself he'd learned his lesson. But 6 months later, there was another woman. And then another. Each time Jennifer discovered the truth, the pattern repeated itself. She would cry, sometimes quietly, sometimes with heaving sobs that shook her whole body. He would apologize, make promises, swear things would change. She would forgive him because she believed that's what love meant. That's what marriage vows demanded. Stick it through the hard times. Fight for what you have. Don't give up. What Jennifer didn't realize, what Paul himself didn't fully understand, was that her tears had become permission. Every time she cried and then forgave, she was teaching him that there were no real consequences to his actions. The tears were painful to watch, sure. They made him feel guilty in the moment. But they also meant she still cared. They meant she was still fighting for him. They meant he could do it again and she'd still be there. Over the years, Jennifer's friends started pulling away. They couldn't watch her go through the same cycle anymore. Her sister Rebecca stopped visiting as often, tired of giving advice that Jennifer wouldn't take. Her mother would call and Jennifer would lie, saying everything was fine, because admitting the truth meant admitting she'd been wrong to stay, wrong to keep forgiving, wrong to believe he would change. Jennifer threw herself into her work, earning promotion after promotion, building a career that gave her identity beyond being Paul's wife. But at home, in the quiet moments, she still believed that her love could save their marriage. She still believed that if she was patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, Paul would wake up one day and choose her. Really choose her, not just come home to her. The tears became a language between them, a twisted form of communication. When Jennifer cried, Paul knew he'd been caught. When Jennifer cried, he knew he needed to comfort her, to make promises. When Jennifer cried, it meant they could eventually move past it and return to their routine. But crying took energy, and over 5 years, Jennifer was running out. Each betrayal took a little more from her. Not just her trust in him, but her trust in herself. How could she keep making the same choice, keep forgiving the same man, keep hoping for different results? She started going to therapy, something she kept from Paul. Her therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, asked questions that made Jennifer uncomfortable. What would it mean if you stopped crying? Dr. Kim asked during one session. What would it mean if you stopped fighting for a marriage where you're the only one fighting? Jennifer couldn't answer those questions at first. The idea of not crying, of not caring, felt like giving up on everything she believed about love and commitment. But the questions planted seeds. Then came the affair that changed everything. Her name was Nicole, and she worked in Paul's office. But this time, Paul was careless. He didn't hide it well. Maybe he was getting bored with the sneaking around. Or maybe he'd just gotten so comfortable with Jennifer's forgiveness that he stopped trying. They met Nicole at a company barbecue. Paul introduced her casually, and Jennifer shook her hand, smiled politely, had no idea. But 2 weeks later, Jennifer saw them together at a restaurant downtown. She'd been meeting a client nearby and decided to grab takeout on the way home. Through the window, she saw Paul and Nicole sitting close, his hand on her knee, both of them laughing at some private joke. Jennifer stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, people brushing past her, car horns honking in the Phoenix heat. She could have walked in, could have made a scene, could have demanded answers right there in front of everyone. Instead, she ordered her food, drove home, and ate dinner alone. When Paul came home 3 hours later with a story about working late, Jennifer didn't confront him. She simply nodded, said okay, and went to take a shower. That night, Jennifer cried in the shower where Paul couldn't hear her. She cried for the girl she'd been 6 years ago, the one who believed love conquered all. She cried for the time she'd wasted, the compromises she'd made, the pieces of herself she'd given away trying to hold together something that was already broken. She cried for the future she'd imagined, the children they'd never have, the partnership that had never truly existed. She cried until she had no tears left, until the water ran cold and her body was exhausted. And when she stepped out of that shower, something fundamental had shifted inside her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply done. The next morning, Paul noticed she seemed different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on how. She made breakfast, kissed him goodbye, went to work like normal. But there was a stillness about her, a quiet that he'd never experienced before. Over the following weeks, Jennifer's behavior confused Paul more and more. She stopped checking his phone. She stopped asking where he was or who he was with. She stopped initiating those painful conversations about their marriage. At first, Paul felt relieved. Maybe she'd finally accepted him for who he was. Maybe they could finally just exist without all the drama and tears. But as the days turned into weeks, Paul started to notice other changes. Jennifer was working out more, looking healthier and more confident. She was going out with friends he didn't know, friends she'd apparently reconnected with. She was laughing more, but not with him. She seemed lighter, happier even, like she'd put down a heavy burden she'd been carrying. And she wasn't crying. No matter what Paul did, no matter how late he stayed out, no matter how obvious his lies became, Jennifer didn't cry. She'd simply nod, say okay, and go about her evening. The lack of reaction started to eat at Paul. He'd gotten so used to her tears, to her pain, that her indifference felt like a rejection more profound than any argument. He started coming home earlier, trying to engage her in conversation, asking about her day. Jennifer would respond politely but briefly, like he was a roommate rather than her husband. One night, Paul stayed out until 3 in the morning, not even bothering to text. When he stumbled into their bedroom, expecting either fury or tears, he found Jennifer sleeping peacefully. In the morning, she didn't mention it. She made coffee, got ready for work, and left. That was the day Paul started to panic. Think about the people in your life who you've taken for granted. Have you ever realized too late that their silence was more frightening than their anger? Paul was beginning to understand something that terrified him. Jennifer's tears had been his security blanket. They meant she cared. They meant she was invested. They meant he mattered enough to hurt her. But her silence, her calm indifference, meant something far worse. It meant he didn't matter anymore. He tried to provoke reactions. He mentioned Nicole's name casually, watching Jennifer's face for any flicker of pain or jealousy. She simply asked if he wanted more coffee. He left his phone unlocked with messages clearly visible. Jennifer walked past it without a glance. He started arguments about nothing, hoping to crack her composure. She'd listen patiently, then calmly disengage, saying she didn't want to fight. Paul felt like he was losing his mind. How could she be so calm? How could she not care? He confided in his friend Derek over drinks one night. "She's planning something," Derek said. "Women don't just stop caring. She's probably talking to a lawyer." But when Paul checked their finances, nothing seemed unusual. Jennifer wasn't hiding money or making suspicious calls. She was simply living her life as if their marriage was already over, even though neither of them had said the words. The revelation came on a Saturday morning in late autumn. Paul woke to find Jennifer in the kitchen, drinking coffee and looking at her laptop. She seemed peaceful, and that peacefulness had become the thing he feared most. "Jennifer," he said, sitting down across from her. "We need to talk." She looked up, her expression pleasant but distant. "Okay, what's going on with you? You've been different. You've been distant." Jennifer took a sip of her coffee, considering her words carefully. "I haven't been distant, Paul. I've just stopped pretending." "Pretending what?" "That we have a marriage. That you're going to change. That my tears or my love or my loyalty mean anything to you." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was simply matter of fact, like she was discussing the weather. Paul felt his chest tighten. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. We always have." Jennifer smiled then, a sad, knowing smile that made Paul's stomach drop. "No, Paul. I worked through it. I cried. I forgave. I convinced myself that next time would be different. You just kept doing what you've always done." "I love you," Paul said, and as the words left his mouth, he realized they might actually be true. Now that he was losing her, really losing her, he could feel the depth of what she'd meant to him. But Jennifer shook her head gently. "You love the idea of me. You love having someone at home who cares, who forgives, who makes your life comfortable while you do whatever you want. But that's not love, Paul. That's convenience. So what are you saying? You want a divorce?" The word hung in the air between them. Jennifer closed her laptop, folding her hands on the table. "I'm saying that I stopped crying 3 weeks ago, and I'm never going to cry over you again. I spent 5 years of my life believing that love meant sacrifice, that marriage meant enduring pain, that commitment meant never giving up no matter how much someone hurt you. But I was wrong." She stood up, carrying her coffee cup to the sink. "I found an apartment. I'm moving out next month. My lawyer will send you the papers." Paul felt panic rising in his chest, a desperate need to fix this, to make her understand. "Jennifer, please. I can change. I will change. Just give me another chance." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that broke him more than tears ever could. "Pity. You've had chances, Paul. Years of chances. Every tear I cried was a chance. Every time I forgave you was a chance. Every morning I woke up next to you and chose to stay was a chance. And you never took any of them seriously because you knew I'd always be here." She walked toward the door, then paused. "The saddest part is that you probably do mean it right now. You probably do want to change. But not because you've realized you've been hurting me. Because you've realized you're losing me. And that's not the same thing." After she left the room, Paul sat alone in the kitchen they'd renovated together 2 years ago. He thought about all the times he'd seen her cry, how he'd felt guilty in those moments, but always found a way to justify his actions afterward. How he'd told himself she was too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. How he'd convinced himself that coming home eventually was enough, that providing financially was enough, that occasionally being nice was enough. He'd never understood that her tears were an alarm, a warning system telling him that something precious was breaking. He'd gotten so used to the sound that he'd stopped hearing it. And now, in the deafening silence of her calm, he finally understood what he'd lost. Over the next few weeks, Paul tried everything. He sent flowers to her office. She thanked him politely and gave them to her assistant. He wrote long emails explaining his feelings. She responded briefly, saying she appreciated him sharing, but her decision was final. He showed up at her new apartment, the one-bedroom place she'd rented across town. She let him in, listened to what he had to say, then kindly but firmly asked him to leave. The divorce proceedings were civil. Jennifer didn't ask for much, didn't try to punish him financially. She just wanted out, wanted to start rebuilding a life where she wasn't constantly bracing herself for the next betrayal, the next lie, the next reason to cry. Paul signed the papers on a cold December morning, 6 months after that conversation in their kitchen. As he watched Jennifer walk away from the lawyer's office, he thought about calling her name, trying one more time to make her understand that he got it now, that he finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him for years. But he didn't, because he knew that understanding something too late doesn't change anything. It just means you have to live with the consequences. A year later, Paul ran into Jennifer at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix. She was with someone, a man who pulled out her chair and made her laugh, the kind of genuine laugh Paul remembered from their early days. She looked happy, actually happy, not the pretend happiness she'd worn like armor during their final months together. When she saw Paul, she smiled and waved, friendly but distant. They made small talk for a few minutes. She asked about his work. He asked about hers. Neither mentioned the divorce or what had happened between them. As Paul left the coffee shop, he realized that Jennifer had done exactly what she said she would. She'd stopped crying over him and never started again. She'd rebuilt her life, found her happiness, moved on completely. And he was still stuck in that moment in their kitchen, finally understanding what he'd had and what he'd thrown away. But understanding doesn't change the past. It just makes the present harder to bear. Paul thought about the other women, the affairs that had seemed so important at the time. He couldn't remember most of their names now. They'd been momentary excitements, temporary escapes from the commitment he'd made. None of them had meant anything, not really. But Jennifer had meant everything. And he'd realized it exactly one tear too late. There's something profound about the moment when someone stops fighting for you. Not because they hate you, but because they've finally learned to love themselves more than they love the idea of fixing you. Jennifer's story isn't unique. Every day, people stay in relationships that hurt them, convinced that love means endurance, that commitment means accepting treatment they would never accept for a friend or family member. They cry and forgive, teaching the people who hurt them that there are no real consequences, that tears are just temporary obstacles before things return to normal. But tears aren't infinite. Patience isn't endless. And there comes a moment, different for everyone, when the crying stops not because the pain is gone, but because something more important has emerged. Self-respect, self-love, the understanding that you deserve better than what you've been accepting. When Jennifer stopped crying, it wasn't because she stopped loving Paul. It was because she finally started loving herself. That's the twist that Paul never saw coming. He'd prepared for anger, for vindictiveness, for drama. He never prepared for her quiet dignity, her calm exit, her refusal to make him the center of her emotional world anymore. The lesson in this story isn't just for the people who cause pain. It's for everyone. If someone in your life is crying because of how you treat them, those tears are a gift. They're a signal that you still matter enough to hurt them, that there's still a relationship worth fighting for, that you still have time to change course. But if you ignore those tears, if you take them for granted, if you assume that forgiveness will always follow pain, you're gambling with something precious. Because one day, the tears will stop. And when they do, it won't be because things got better. It will be because the person crying has finally understood that they deserve better than what you've been giving them. For those of you who have been the one crying, who have been staying and forgiving and hoping things will change, Jennifer's story is also for you. Your tears mean something. Your pain is valid. Your loyalty is valuable. But none of those things require you to stay in a situation that continues to hurt you. There is strength in leaving. There is courage in choosing yourself. There is wisdom in understanding that some people will never value what they have until it's gone, and by then, it should be too late. Paul learned this lesson the hardest way possible. He learned it in the silence that followed Jennifer's tears, in the empty house they'd once shared, in the divorce papers that made their separation official, in the coffee shop where he watched her laugh with someone else. He learned that tears are a language, and silence is a verdict. He learned that "I can change" means nothing if you only say it when someone is walking away. He learned that the pain of loss is so much worse than the discomfort of growth would have been. Most importantly, he learned that some doors, once closed, can never be opened again. Not because the person on the other side is cruel or unforgiving, but because they finally found peace on the other side of that door, and they're never coming back to the chaos they left behind. So here's the question for you, wherever you're watching from. Have you ever been Jennifer, crying over someone who never valued those tears? Have you ever been Paul, realizing too late what you lost? What would you do if you recognized yourself in this story right now, either as the person crying or the person causing the tears? If someone is still crying over you, there's still time. There's still a chance to become the person they've been hoping you would be. But when the crying stops, when the silence sets in, when someone looks at you with calm indifference instead of tears, understand what that means. It means you've run out of chances. It means the relationship you thought was solid has already ended, even if the paperwork hasn't caught up yet. It means you missed your opportunity to be better, and now you get to live with the consequences of who you chose to be. Jennifer stopped crying, and in that moment, she saved herself. The question is, will you recognize the tears in your life before they stop? Or will you learn the same lesson Paul learned, alone in the silence that follows the last tear? What would you have done in Jennifer's place? Could you have walked away with that much dignity, or would you have wanted some kind of revenge? And if you were Paul, would you have changed before it was too late, or would you have kept taking those tears for granted until they stopped? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts matter. Your stories matter. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something or think about your own relationships, hit that subscribe button. Because stories that feel uncomfortably real, stories that make us look at ourselves and the choices we make, those are the stories we need to keep telling. Thank you for watching. Take care of the people who cry for you before they stop crying.